Good evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's Camden Conference community event program titled Germany Today, a Model of Democratic Capitalism with Tom Remington. I'm Brenda Harrington, program librarian at the Belfast Free Library. I want to thank you all for joining us. The Belfast Free Library is happy to continue to host the Camden Conference community event series and glad we can continue to do so virtually for obvious reasons. We will be hosting 2 additional programs in anticipation of this year's conference, Europe, Challenged at Home and Abroad. Judy Stein from the Camden Conference Community Events Committee will describe those programs during her introduction. Before I turn this over to Judy, I want to remind you all to please keep your mics muted. And we're asking that everybody put their questions in the chat and we'll get to them during the Q&A at the end. So with that, I'm going to turn this over to Judy. Judy.
Thank you and welcome everybody. With this, if last year was different, this year is going to be different as well. And let me start briefly by introducing Camden Conference, then telling you a little bit about the 2 programs that will follow this one in Belfast, one in December and one in January, and introduce Tom and move us along quickly to tonight. Europe Challenged at Home and Abroad. Okay, what does that mean? So the intent of the conference this year is to look at the countries, the European countries, to look at Europe broadly and think about the relationships that these countries have with each other, the things that they're confronting internally now, and their relationship with the US and with those countries that surround Europe as well. So it's a handful. We have speakers from the US and speakers from Europe as well. If anyone does not know, the conference is February 25th to 27th, and it will be live and online. It will be live at the high school in Camden, which will hold 800 and some odd for any of you who are here and remember when we did a Friday night there years ago. However, for this conference, it will hold 400 roughly, and everyone else is going to be welcome online. Tickets will go on sale the beginning of December, and follow along and watch for it. I think everyone who's on knows, we have community events that take place or are sponsored by the libraries in the area, by some other organizations in the area. The area is pretty broad. There are any number coming from South Portland, as well as those coming from Mid-Coast Maine and some coming from a little further east. I will introduce Tom, who is in very shortly. And I'm just going to tell everybody to check your calendars and put them on. Seth Singleton is going to talk about Russia's relationship, with Russia's relationship with Europe and European countries in December. And Seth has spoken before, and I think many of you know this is Russia is his home base, and so we are looking forward to that. And in January, Dick Topping, whom you've all heard before and who teaches at senior college, and this time Marianne is going to join him in this conversation. They were in they were in Berlin when the wall went up. And this is going to be a discussion that few of us know anything about, of what it was like in Germany when the wall went up. So watch for those. They're coming in Belfast. And Tom, who has also spoken for us before and who is part-time resident in Northport. And Tom is a professor emeritus of political science from Emory. Again, he and Seth go back on the subject of Russia. And currently, Tom is particularly interested in what's going on in Germany. He is currently a visiting professor of government at Harvard, and the class he is teaching is the politics of economic inequality. So, Tom, I'm turning it over to you. You get to introduce Germany. Very quickly, everybody, I will collect questions. I will try to put them together and keep them going. I will watch the chat. So put your questions there, please. Thank you. Tom, it's yours.
Thank you, Judy. It's a great pleasure and honor to be here and to be part of the Camden Conference Community Event Series. I wanted to talk about a country that I have some interest and knowledge of, because as Judy said, the conference in February will be dealing more with broader trends affecting all of Europe. So I'm going to share my screen and present some slides that will give you the title. I want to highlight the fact that the title has a question mark. Model of Democratic Capitalism, question mark. And I want to come back to that. That's a theme for me. The image on the slide shows a campaign poster from 1976 when the Social Democratic Party, SPD, was campaigning, and they put forth their platform and they said, well, we want to work further on model Germany, Model of Deutschland. We want to work further on it. Well, why is that significant? For me, it highlights a key point. They were coming to power after the Christian Democratic Party, the Conservative Party, which is also Angela Merkel's party, had been in power since the end of the war. And this was a major shift in the policy orientation of the government. So what were they going to do? Were they going to overturn everything that had been going on reasonably successfully in the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s? And no, their idea was we're going to work further on it. We're going to build on the foundation that's been established and take it further. And the theme of continuity is one that I really want to highlight in my talk. So they were responding to the idea that in the 1970s was very widespread that there was a German model. Newsweek magazine highlighted this idea, oh, there's the German model, and people debated it. And it's never good, I think, to look at a country and say, well, they are the model. Nevertheless, I do want to ask, well, to what degree does the German political and economic and social environment have something that we can learn from? And I think there is something. That's the theme of my talk tonight. So they wanted to build on a real pro-business, reasonably conservative economic policy, but they wanted to expand social benefits, social inclusion, and they especially adhered to the idea that was built in from the late 40s on of shared prosperity. They wanted the economy to prosper, but they wanted everyone to share in that prosperity. Now, my own view of the matter is that shared prosperity has to a large measure worked. It has helped to avoid a kind of polarization in Germany that we have in the United States. And as a consequence, I believe democracy there is more stable than it is in the United States. This is a paradox. If we think back to the defeat of the Nazis in 1945, and by the way, it's this day in 1938, it was Kristallnacht. So it's worth remembering the appalling episodes of German history that led to the most aggressive and genocidal regime, maybe in human history. and that was defeated so thoroughly in 1945. And the world looked at Nazi Germany and thought, what on earth after 2 world wars is there to build on? If we had polled the historians of the world at that point, 75 years ago, and said, all right, in 75 years, which country is likely to have a stable democracy? Which country was more likely to have an attempt by violent extremists, violent nationalist extremists, to storm the Capitol building, to stop the outcome of a fair election that the opposition party won? Would they have predicted that it was the US that would have had that? I mean, I don't think so. So go back to what it looked like. That's the Reichstag Building as it looked then, with the US GIs standing in front of it after it had been thoroughly shelled. And then this is the rebuilt building. Maybe some of you have been over there today. This is where the German parliament meets in Berlin. You note the transparent dome on top. It was designed by the British architect, Norman Foster. And you can go up there. Maybe some of you have had this experience. You look down on the assembled delegates who are your representatives. You look down on them, quite literally. I mean, they built that symbolism into it. So I would say they certainly have had episodes in recent years and recent decades in which there have been far-right extremists resorting to violence, but less than the United States. And I think, as I say, that I think prosperity for all, this formula, which to a large degree they have adhered to, is a major reason for this stability of their democracy. And these are the appalling images that you're only too familiar with from January 6th. This is, I think, emblematic. These images are not January 6th, but these are some of the people who, as we know, are part of this polarization that we have in the United States, which has led to extremism. And in my view, it's this high income inequality where many people feel left out, angry, resentful, and turn to extreme solutions. I believe that's one reason that democracy here is experiencing major challenges, much more in the United States now than in Germany, as paradoxical historically as that is. Now, there's an American philosopher named Susan Neiman. She grew up in Atlanta, where I taught for 39 years. She's Jewish. She and her family live in Germany. She's a philosopher, and she wrote a recent book, which I do recommend. And she argues in this book that the Germans have confronted the racist horrors of their past more successfully than have Americans. She does not equate the Holocaust with slavery and Jim Crow in terms of the magnitude of their evil. She is instead comparing the degree to which the two societies have tried thoroughly to grapple with their actual history. And she says the Germans have gone further than we have. And a lot of the book documents that. It deals with the US and it deals with Germany. You can judge for yourself whether you agree. Now, I think two of the figures that are responsible for the relative success of this model are Ludwig Earhart, shown on the left, characteristic. He's got his own book open, Wohlstand für alle, which is welfare or well-being, prosperity for everybody. His trademark cigar. He was, in some ways, considered the architect of that German economic miracle that built prosperity starting in the late 40s. He really did have a great deal to do with it. On the right is a theorist named Walter Eucken, who's largely unknown in the United States and is one of the founders of a school of thought called Ordo liberalism. These Ordo liberals, including Eucken on the right, were anti-Nazi, anti-fascist, anti-socialist. They hated the Bolsheviks, they hated planned economies, But they were also very worried about the giant cartels and the trusts and the monopolies that were dominating capitalism globally in the first decades of our century. We're very familiar with the giant trusts in the United States that Teddy Roosevelt went after, and Woodrow Wilson and Louis Brandeis. And these ordoliberals like Eucken was an economist, said we need competition, we need a market economy. And the market economy has to be based on competition, because competition both in the marketplace and the political arena, that's what's necessary to preserve liberty. So they were not part of, let's say, Milton Friedman School of Thought or University of Chicago or Hayek, if you know that way of thinking, that kind of laissez-faire thinking. It was a different understanding of capitalism and liberalism. And in Germany, the key is that ordo-liberal view of market capitalism became part of what the Germans called, and still call, the social market economy. A market economy that works to benefit society at large, not just those who benefit. So there's a very strong ethical spirit in that social market economy way of thinking. It's still influential. Now, as you know, Angela Merkel will be stepping down now that the elections have been held. She has been chancellor since November of 2005. It's a remarkably long run. Her government is a coalition government. The new government, whenever it does form, will also be coalition. She won't be in it. Her party probably won't be in it. And as you know, because she's gotten so much, I think, attention around the world, she has represented that consensus-seeking tradition, moderation. She's very cautious. And the result is the policies under Merkel have been centrist. Now, Merkel is, by the way, a great admirer of the ordoliberal tradition and a great admirer of the social market economy. And like the ordoliberals back in the 40s to 50s, she strongly believes that ethics must guide social policy. And that came out when she made that decision in 2015 to admit 1 million refugees from Iraq, and Syria, Afghanistan. She did so because she said it's the right thing to do. It wasn't politically popular. Her father was a Lutheran pastor who went back to East Germany after the communists took over in order to serve the people there. She trained as a physicist, which was safe under a communist regime. But what the physics training did for her is to give her a very analytical style of thinking. So she has this ethical side. She really, those who know her say she really is grounded in actually a strong religious faith, which guides her sense of what is right, what is wrong. She's very good at politics, but one reason she's cautious is she really analyzes every situation the way a scientist does. So you'd say, well, what is her legacy? Well, she's had to deal with an awful lot of crises. In 2009, 10, 11, there was the Eurozone debt crisis, the refugee crisis. Then Trump came to power, and the question was, is America a reliable partner? She contended with the rise of the far right, which was partly a response to admitting all those refugees, and most lately, the COVID-19 crisis. So really, it's been one crisis after another that she's tried to steer Germany through. Now, my overview is Germany is a stable democracy. It does have low inequality, but despite what many people think, it is not a welfare state. And I can't tell you how many people I meet who say, yeah, well, they're a welfare state. Well, they're not. They're not a social democratic, typical Scandinavian type of welfare state. And they are not socialist. Powerfully capitalist orientation, but influenced by that ordo-liberal tradition. believing in markets, but believing that the market economy must serve the society. For example, the German Constitution says we respect the rights of capital, but capital has a social obligation. That frugality, we don't want to spend more than we earn, is built into the Constitution now. The budget deficit may not exceed a certain proportion of GDP. Of course, as their GDP goes up, they can run a larger deficit. So it's this growth must serve shared prosperity. Very different from the radical laissez-faire ideology that's characteristic really of, I'd say, the Republican Party since, we'll say, Reagan's time. It's not a social democratic welfare state model. And the consequence, as I said, is lower polarization. There is an extremist fringe, of course, as there is throughout Europe, but it's smaller than in the US. Now, I want to get down to some data, if you'll forgive me. I want to look at the inequality measures. As Judy mentioned, I teach a course on economic inequality, and this is the kind of thing I look at. This is the ratio of the people at the 90th percentile in the United States to the 10th, and very, very high. And that's on the right axis. This is the same percentile ratio, the 90th to the 10th, far, far lower in Germany. This is what's the ratio of the median income in Germany to the mean. Median is relative to the mean is much higher. Relative to the mean in the United States, the median is way lower. At this point, it's lower than 75% of the mean. What is that telling us? Average income in the US is going up, 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 driven by the concentration of income growth at the top. This is a good measure of inequality. Now, you know, Germany has 16 federal states. They call them Länder, and 10 of them were the old West Germany, and 6 of them were incorporated after the fall of the wall that Dick Topping will be talking about, because he was there when the wall went up. The wall went up, of course, to divide Berlin, but we think of the wall as this boundary that was really put up with barbed wire and guards. And when the wall came down in 1990, the process of unification began, where all of East Germany was simply incorporated into the Federal Republic. So the entire model, all this shared prosperity, the Constitution, only a couple of things of the old model remained from East Germany. One was the little traffic light guys, the little red and green people that they have on the traffic lights, very cute, the little implementer, very cute, but that's just about it. So a lot of East Germans feel, oh, we lost our way of life. We lost everything. I want to talk about that. There's an economic gap, and there's this psychological gap. There's resentments in the West. Oh, our East German cousins, really, they don't appreciate how grateful, they're not grateful, we've been so generous, which they have. The East Germans say, oh, you're treating us like we're subjects of a colonial power. We feel left out, we feel left behind. There was so much that was good about our model. You criticize everything, you destroyed everything. And what they call the wall in the head. The wall in the head, die Mauer im Kopf. There's still this division. And this is now, what, 30 years after the unification. And it comes out in voting trends. This is the after taxes and transfers, the economic gap. Economic gap is still wide, it's closing, but it's still there. And this is the political gap. There's, by the way, a north-south gap down here this is Bavaria, and this is Baden-Württemberg. They're really prosperous. This is where the Christian Democratic vote here, and in this fairly prosperous West industrial area. This is the Christian Democratic vote and the vote they just held in September. This is the SPD, the Social Democratic Party vote, and you see it more to some degree in the East, but you see it very much up in the North. So there's a North-South gap. in Germany. We have a north-south gap in a lot of countries, including the United States. But what I really want to focus on is this voting for the AfD, which is a far-right party. It's like the MAGA movement in the United States or a lot of the far-right parties elsewhere in Europe. They hate immigrants. They feel dislocated. They're resentful. They're often quite violent. And you see where their votes are concentrated. It's the eastern parts of Germany. And this most recent parliamentary election, they lost a little bit of support. They are in the parliament. They got enough seats to be in the parliament, but they got about 10%. And most of their support was in the East, where they took the dark red shows they got, in some places as much as a quarter of the vote. So they have strongholds. So this is I won't go through all of this. We can come back to anything you're interested in. A little quick rundown through history. The post-war rebuilding of Germany included Marshall Plan assistance, along with a lot of German ideas about how they should rebuild. Very powerful factor was joining the European Union. Another powerful factor was the strong Atlantic orientation, which for them means being part of NATO and really a strong relationship with the United States. I've mentioned ordoliberalism. German economy is very strongly oriented exports. You probably know that, but their niche is not in low quality, low value-added goods. It's advanced manufacturing and the like. And I want to call attention to a point maybe you're familiar with. It's so important and doesn't get enough attention. This very strong stratum of smaller and medium-sized businesses that they call the Mittelstand. It's not the same thing as the middle class, overlaps with it. But the Mittelstand really is companies. And often they are producing very specialized goods. They are often in a niche, and they might produce inputs for auto manufacturers, but many of them are family owned. And they are kind of a backbone of the economy. They do a lot of the apprenticeship training, and they are still viable. They've been a part of the German economy for a long time. Actually, Karl Marx said, oh, well, the Mittelstand will die out, capitalism will swallow them up. Well, it hasn't. Germans also have a democratic constitution. There's several features that preserve democracy. One is the federalism, so that the federal government is not allowed to get too powerful. It has to share its powers with the states. There are a number of other guardrails. The election law keeps a high threshold to getting into parliament, so the fringe parties can't get in. There's a constitutional law and a constitutional court that says the court has to preserve democracy, and they do. There's stuff that they will outlaw. The government subsidizes religious communities, which are then expected to uphold democracy. The government subsidizes media. There's no Fox News. And this tremendous sense of social solidarity. The West Germans pay a solidarity tax, pretty high, in order to subsidize the unemployed people and the retraining in East Germany. Do you know they've transferred something like 2 trillion euros since 1990? It's just a huge burden. But how do they do it? Well, there is social protection, but mainly it's through employment-based contributions in the way that we do Social Security through the employer. They do pensions and unemployment and such somewhat through the tax system, but most of it is still employment-based. That's why it's so very different from the social democratic model. There's a powerful belief that labor and employers must be partners. This is the principle of social partnership. They still adhere to this idea, which means they balance each other, they check each other, but they share in the gains. If they have to tighten their belts, which they do, of course, sometimes, those costs are shared across labor and employers. There's collective bargaining. There's, as you know, this so-called co-determination. That means, as you probably know, workers are elected to corporate boards to serve as a watchdog on the budget of the company and help steer the company, but it gives workers a stake in the prosperity of their company. There's this dual education system that we call apprenticeships, where labor and employers and taxpayers all pay for investment in training. They have labor courts, which adjudicate disputes as they come up between labor and employers. And there are disputes. They do sometimes have very bitter strikes, but not very often. And more routine disputes are handled over wages or benefits or employment conditions. Labor courts handle that. And the idea is always the labor court must adhere to, and this is in the Constitution, must adhere to the principle of social partnership. In other words, no one side wins everything. Yeah, there have been some major strains. Immigration, especially that refugee crisis in 2015, when, as I said, just over 1 million refugees were admitted. There were some horrible incidents where some of those refugees committed dreadful crimes. There's enormous criticism of Merkel and of the government. But you know, with time, that crisis has subsided, and those refugees are actually becoming absorbed into German society. Likewise, there was a huge strain with unification. And they had to absorb this burden of subsidizing the total restructuring of most of the enterprises over there that really weren't worth much, and a lot of the unemployment and pensions and so on. But they've absorbed that for the most part. Big crisis, of course, over the debt crisis. This is when Greece and to some degree Italy and Spain were not able to pay their obligations. They're in the Eurozone. That is, they use the euro, but they can't really afford to be in the Eurozone. Germany was considered to be all tight-fisted, wouldn't help bail them out enough. One of the speakers we're having in February, Mark Blythe, may very well talk about it. And he takes a very different line on this than I do. Merkel took a lot of criticism for being tight-fisted. And she was a little bit, I'd say, clumsy in her rhetoric. She used the stereotype of the Swabian housewife, you know, the housewife from southern Germany who keeps a close watch on her purse and doesn't spend more than she earns. And there was a lot of criticism for Germany. But the fact is, Merkel and Germany actually got through that crisis by persuading the other Northern Europeans, who were way more tight-fisted, didn't get as much criticism. But it was the Germans that were able to negotiate the debt restructuring that got everybody through the crisis. Germany doesn't get enough credit for solving the crisis. They get all the blame for making it worse at the time. My point is, Germany has managed through, I think, incremental adaptation of its institutions to get through these decades. So people now are saying, well, in the post-Angela Merkel era, is Germany really ready for the challenges ahead? The Economist magazine, for example, has been very critical. Oh, she leaves behind a big mess. Well, there are problems, but there are always problems. And are they worse than any other leader left behind? I don't think so. They do say Germany is less prepared to enter the world of digital technology, digitally managed production. Maybe, though they sure do use digital production technology in advanced manufacturing. They have a whole field called mechatronics, where you should see their auto industries, which are highly automated and do use digital technologies. They are less financialized, but on on the whole, that's quite a good thing. They do still have to deal with the immigrant inflow, but that is a much less severe crisis. Inequality is rising. There's just no question about it. And wealth inequality. And as you get wealth inequality, you know, it accumulates at the top. And people who have wealth pass it on. And their wealth taxes are quite low. And I suspect they're going to see some major increases in taxes on property, taxes on real estate to help mitigate that. I think that's going to happen. And of course, there's a generational change, as there is everywhere. And I think that will challenge the social partnership principle. So I will finish with this last slide. Is Germany a model? No. Their history reflects these unique, thankfully unique experiences, totalitarianism and genocide, major aggressive wars. They have a history of enlightened absolutism. They have a history of failed democracy. Certainly the Weimar democracy failed. But they also, because of that experience, I think, have worked very hard to take on board the principle of never again, nie wieder, never again. I think that helps us understand what we could learn, which in part, I think, has to do with how to use a market economy to serve a larger social good, how to reconcile democracy and a market economy, how to protect competition, but balance the costs and benefits of capitalism. Now, they've had pretty good leaders, and that doesn't have to always be the case. They have been strongly committed to European integration and the Atlantic Alliance. That's worked well for them. Now the question is the United States a reliable partner? Merkel said, and that's the question we have to ask. And I think our speakers at the Camden Conference in February are going to address that point. What do the Europeans think? Is the US a long-term partner for them? So that's what they're worrying about. Is the United States going to be a champion of democracy in global markets? So I'm cautiously optimistic that Germany can continue, though as they stay in the stock market, past performance is no guarantee future results. So I'll stop slides here, and hopefully some questions have come in on the chat, and Judy can moderate them.
Okay, I'm unmuted, I think. I'm going to start with one. You spoke early on about the role of the post-war recovery, and the post-war recovery in Europe was heavily dependent in places on the Marshall Plan aid. What do you see as the role of that aid as you looked at in Germany at its response?
Yeah, people often say, well, their prosperity is due to the fact that they got a lot of generous American Marshall Plan aid, and so I've actually studied that to ask, how much is that true? There was aid. Remember, we were helping about 16 countries, and Germany only got about 11% of the aid. There was a strong feeling in the United States that after having caused this war, our allies needed the aid more than Germany did. They didn't get all that much money, and our allies did get a lot, didn't do as well as Germany. So right there, it tells you the aid can't have been the major factor. Where aid made a difference was not the aid, but the fact that the planning for the Marshall Plan, all the American architecture went into that, required Germany and the other countries, France, Italy, the Benelux countries, to cooperate in European integration. So we used the Marshall Plan as leverage to build the European Union. It was a deliberate strategy. Most of the Germans were very glad for that to happen because the Germans said, we're going to use trade as our way of generating prosperity. We need to export our products. So they wanted these markets. And so it was less the Marshall Plan money than the Marshall Plan mandates that required that as a condition of getting the aid, the countries participate in the rebuilding around this community, this economic community that became the Union.
Okay, we've got one I'm going to read. To what extent is the East-West divide a result of leaders like Merkel, who I agree are wonderful leaders, but didn't or don't really understand the emotional or cultural divide between the two Germanys, but instead focus on the purely rational reasons why the East realizes how wonderful things are?
Or should realize how wonderful things are.
Oh, thank you.
Merkel has been a little, I think, tone deaf in the way she's talked about this. There's a recent biography of Angela Merkel by a journalist named Kati Marton, and it's called Chancellor. And it just came out. I've read it. It's quite good.
It's terrific.
And she refers to that. However, I would point out the fact that this division goes back well before Merkel was in power. And it came from the very beginning of unification. I'll give you an anecdote, if you'll indulge me. I'm very close to a family in Germany whom I lived with in 1965 when I was a student. I was a high school student, and I spent a summer living with them. And the parents were of the war generation. The father fought in the war. There were 3 kids. And they had relatives in the East. And over many decades now, I have seen Germany in part through the eyes of the family. The father's sister, she was allowed to come over for visits because they allowed out old people. Then after unification, she could come for a longer visit. She complained. She was a great complainer. And one of the things she said before the wall fell was, we work twice as hard as you do, you in the West. We work twice as hard and we're paid half as well. After unification, and West Germans and East Germans could observe each other and understand each other and work together. My German father said to me, we learned that they work half as well as we do, but want to be paid twice as much. The productivity is low. Why is it low? Oh, well, technology is not as good, but now they're using West German technology. Over those decades, the East German regime inculcated attitudes that we see throughout the former communist world. A sense of dependency, of resentment, of helplessness, passivity, and while there is an understandable reaction, we must be sympathetic to them. They are our cousins and our brothers and our sisters. East Germans also indulge in a certain nostalgia, the way we all do as we get older. Oh, it was all better in our youth. And there's a lot of that. So there's a generational divide going on here, plus the same dislocations that we know very well in Rust Belt states. I'm from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and we know what in the post-industrial era is very different in Silicon Valley than it is in Bradford, Pennsylvania. There is that post-industrial thinking in many parts of Germany. the world has passed us by, and we're angry and resentful. So I actually don't think it's for the leaders in West Germany. I don't think their rhetoric is really the issue. It's the same dislocations that we are experiencing in many parts of the world, where we just don't know how to generate hope and opportunity with an appropriate economic model. I think subsidies and unemployment assistance are needed, but it's not enough. And I think probably the Europeans throughout Europe, and certainly the Germans, have to step up their ability to increase that sense of, I can make something of my life.
Given Germany's history, Tom, how likely is it that some new ultranationalist, militaristic, aggressively ideologically could take power again?
Of course it's possible. Of course it's possible. And I'm the last to deny the strains of German history that have indulged a kind of blind nationalist, aggressive militarist reflex. It's there. What's so impressive is how hard the last couple of generations have worked to overcome it because of the traumas of the war. But remember, there has been a huge re-education effort in Germany. My German brothers and sisters are part of a generation that went through a civic education that exposed them to the realities of their history, frankly, in a way that we haven't done in the United States. So they have worked really hard, Germany as a whole, and certainly everybody involved in the educational enterprise, schools, media, churches, interest groups, all work very hard to preserve that sense of never again. As generations turn over, of course, it can happen again.
A couple of questions about immigrants and the role of the place of immigrants and what's happening. And one of those questions speaks to whether you foresee increasing resistance to immigration, particularly in East Germany, where the population decline is more extreme.
Yeah, it's a serious strain. There's no doubt about it. And I think the only way to approach it is to say, how does Germany compare to other countries that are also facing aging populations and an inflow of immigrants? Indeed, the issue applies to Maine, where in many parts of Maine, we have an aging population and we have rapid growth of a non-white population. And we have the problem of absorbing people, not just treating them as guest workers, but as part of your society. Remember, Germany has been dealing with immigrants, and every decade since the war ended, immediately after the war, there was a decade where they brought in a huge number of refugees from not just the Soviet occupied zone, but from other parts like the former German parts of Czechoslovakia, German-speaking lands, where the Czechs expelled the Germans. So everybody floods west, including my German parents. And so there's this huge influx of refugees, which for about a year and a half was a burden. And then very quickly, they all being German speakers, got absorbed, and many had an education. Then, as they ran short of labor, Germany in the late 50s and 60s began importing labor, first from Italy, and then they would look to Yugoslavia, and they brought in guest workers. And the idea is, well, they're only going to be here for a while. And then they brought in, as you know, Turks, huge influx of Turkish immigrants, Gastarbeiter, guest workers. And the German attitude was, well, they're only here temporarily. As a German social scientist then later suddenly realized, it suddenly came to him, oh, by heaven, we thought they were labor. It turns out they're people. Yeah, they were people. They brought their families. They sank roots. And so with time, those people who were from increasingly easterly places, it would be Yugoslavia, then it was Turkey, and now it's Iraq and Syria and Afghanistan, or Africa, farther and farther away, and darker skins. The Germans have to say, oh, well, now they're a part of our society too. The thing is Germany better equipped to handle that than our other societies? And I'd say the odds are slightly better for Germany. But in the East, yes, it's going to be a huge problem. Is Germany better positioned than France? Maybe.
If you look back at the U.S. coming out of World War II, you know, as the great leaders, and Germany coming out of World War II from a very different position. And so for them to become respectable, they had to function very differently than the US. Do you see that as a factor in the relative cohesiveness, or at least at the moment, especially among the West Germans, they've avoided the polarization that has happened in the US? Do you see a relationship there at all?
Yeah, but I don't overstress it. 2 points of comparison for that. Germany and Japan. The United States occupied both. The United States worked fairly hard to rebuild institutions, economic, political, social. The US worked pretty hard to eradicate whatever the roots were that had led to these extreme nationalist, fascist, Nazi, aggressive regimes. The re-education effort in Germany took about a generation, but it built on indigenous roots of German Enlightenment philosophy, which had a strong ethical orientation, of the ordo-liberal tradition, quite frankly, of the fact that there were democratically minded politicians who had not been part of Nazism, who'd been in exile or untainted by it. So what we have to realize is, to a very large extent, Germany's confrontation with itself in building a new alternative model of democratic capitalism had indigenous foundations. Japan, the leaders, obviously also felt horror and shame, but without the same confrontation with the past, which is why Japanese politicians continue to pay great homage to the leaders who had committed atrocities in China. They still refuse to acknowledge what they did to Koreans or Korean comfort women. So the blindness to the past that we see in Japan is not acceptable in Germany. There's a difference. Another comparison, West and East Germany. And here I differ from Susan Neiman in her book, which I admire, but I don't agree with her on this point. East Germany did undergo this kind of confrontation with the past under this pro-Soviet East German communist regime. The rebuilding, the communist propaganda was all in terms of, we were the fascists. I mean, we were the victims of fascism. We opposed fascism. We, the communists, were the victims of fascism. Therefore, we bear no guilt. As Germans, we bear no guilt. That's the line. And that's part of why East Germans today refuse to think of themselves as sharing in common German history. The re-education effort in East Germany was entirely different. And I would say it did not inculcate democratic values.
And on a somewhat different vein, you talked a little bit about education in Germany now, and the use of apprenticeships and the building that way. And we certainly are having endless conversations here about retraining and re-education. Do you want to build on that a little bit, Tom, and what they're doing and how you see that moving forward?
Sure, glad to. The United States, like many countries, are so interested in how the Germans handle that system of training, which seems to work awfully well for them. In Germany, it keeps youth unemployment really low. So the youth unemployment in Germany is way lower than in other countries in Europe, especially France or Italy, Spain, where levels of unemployment among young people are just astronomical. Many fewer people dropping out of the workforce. Here in Maine, we actually have an unusually low and unfortunately low level of labor force participation on the part of young people. Why? I think in Maine, in the United States and around the world, there are things we can learn from that German system, but we can't adopt it. I wish we could. What can we learn? Well, the notion that the whole society has to commit itself to investing in people, in what the economists would call human capital, the ability of people to be contributive and productive. The whole society bears that obligation, and the cost of doing it is balanced between labor and business and the taxpayers. So there's a kind of a sense of shared obligation to making sure that everybody has an opportunity to get some kind of usable skill. And when the Germans talk about a usable skill, it's not a 6-week or 6-month training. Their apprenticeships are 3, 3.5, and 4 years. So when the German companies come to the United States and they say, oh, we want to set up a training program with the local community college in order to ensure that we have well-qualified production workers and so on for our factory, the Americans say, oh yeah, we can turn out people that you need in 6 months. The Germans are horrified. We need people, they say, who have a deep and broad foundation. And that enables those individuals then to advance, if they want to, into higher levels of production or into management. And there's a whole system for that. So, the German system increasingly lets you then say, okay, I finished my apprenticeship. Now I'm going to go into a tertiary, a higher education level. So it does increase opportunity for individuals. The point is, if the whole society is committed to it, with the costs and gains shared pretty broadly, it makes the whole society pretty prosperous. And that's why German economic growth on an average annual basis has been higher than its neighbors. It works. And I think that idea of a social commitment is something we could learn from.
I agree, actually. When you say we can't adopt it, would you? Oh.
No.
Oh, well, let me explain what I mean. Number one, we don't have a well-organized big labor union movement. Very few workers now are members of unions, and that's number one. So we don't really even have collective bargaining. So we don't have a labor sector to serve as a social partner. Missing that. Our employer associations are more fragmented than are the German ones. And remember, German businesses are required by law to join business chambers. So the small and the medium and the big businesses all have to pay in to a chamber. What does the chamber do for them? It makes sure that there's a pool of trained labor. It makes sure that there are quality standards. It shares marketing information. It promotes the quality of their product in advertising. So you have to join. You can't be a free rider. You can say, I'm too small of a business. I'm going to let the big guys do it, but then I don't get the benefits of all of the qualified labor that are here in our labor market. I don't think we could require American businesses to pay a labor training tax or to join labor chambers or business chambers. I don't think we could do that. We do everything on a voluntary basis. But we could say at the sectoral level or at the local level, oh, well, let's get all the businesses in our community to participate because it benefits our community. And we are seeing some of that here in Maine and in the country. And we are seeing some sectoral associations, like manufacturers associations. We have a very active effort by the Maine Manufacturers Association to make sure that there's upgrading and training. And we have similar associations around the country. So we can do it, but it's going to be more decentralized than the Germans would have.
Okay, I think I'm coming back to the question of political volatility. Do you see the parliamentary structure as I'm sorry, as suppressing that kind of volatility? You know,
yes, in the sense that if we can also talk about the election law, the way their electoral law works. I mentioned there's a very high threshold. So in a parliamentary system, you have to have a rule about how many votes a party gets in order to receive seats. And in some countries, that threshold is extremely low. In Israel, it's very low. In Netherlands, it's very low. In Turkey, it's extremely high. In Germany, it's moderately high. What does that do? It means if you're a tiny little crazy party with 3.5 followers, but a very active leader who wants to get a lot of publicity, that party isn't going to get enough votes to win a seat. So that means the debate in parliament tends to be a little bit more moderate. The party landscape tends to be more moderate. There's more gravitation to the center. And so, yeah, on the whole, that's been a stabilizing factor. Then you also have a different two-chamber system than we have in the United States. In our country, as everybody knows, each state gets 2 senators, no matter whether it's a huge population state like California or a very small one, gets 2 senators. In Germany, every state gets senators, but it's roughly proportional, not exactly, but it's roughly proportional to population. It's also roughly proportional to the parties that have won the votes in that state. So the upper chamber acts as a balance wheel, the way upper chambers often do. It kind of can slow things down. It kind of is a check on the lower chamber. We're used to that, but the representation is a little bit different. And again, it's a little bit more broadly representational, which means politics there is not this kind of ferocious, it's death. If I don't win, it's death. Or if I don't win, it means it was a fraudulent election, which we've fallen into over here. So I would say, yeah, there are features of their parliamentary representation that do act to help keep down some of the volatility and certainly the extremism.
Anybody out there, any more questions? I will raise one for you, and then I think perhaps we'll wrap up if I don't see any more here. We talked about the conference itself, looking at challenges at home and challenges abroad. What do you see going forward as Germany's greatest challenge?
I'll divide it into 2 sides. One is on the domestic side. It's preserving these elements that I think have served them well since the late 40s, preserving those elements through continuing strains and generational change. On the international relations side, I would say we're in an era where American leadership in NATO cannot be taken for granted, or American leadership as a global power adhering to certain principles having to do with freedom of movement, global security. People used the phrase, which was kind of unfortunate, that Angela Merkel was now the leader of the free world. That's really unfortunate because it's a heck of a burden. Nobody should have to, especially a German leader, for crying out loud, where Germans debate whether to send 2 soldiers from the Bundeswehr to a crisis in a foreign country. How on earth can anyone want Germany to be a leader for international security? So there's got to be an effective mechanism for collective security. The whole formula for the success of the European Union is Germany has to be balanced by Britain and France and the offshore power of the United States. Remember the famous old saying by one of the British statesmen about the real purpose of NATO, that NATO was to keep the Americans in, the Russians out, and the Germans down. Remember the qualms that everyone had about Germany reunifying. The French leader at the time saying, "Oh, I love Germany. I love Germany so much, I think there should be 2 of them." People are, of course, afraid of excessive German power. And yet Germany actually has achieved this position of dominance. Heaven forbid that the German leader, whoever it may be, should be the leader of the free world. So how does Germany become a leader in thought or in practice or in values? But heaven forbid that it should then say, well, then we should be able to exercise political or military power commensurate with our economic power. That's not desirable for anybody.
I'm going to go back to one we talked. We had a couple of questions about immigration and the role of immigration, but I think we had one that perhaps was a little asked the question a little differently, and I didn't catch it as I addressed it. But as Germany took so many immigrants, how are they fitting into that society now? How do they fit in? How do they get social services? Do they become citizens? What's happening to that large group?
Well, first of all, if you come in as an immigrant or a refugee, you are entitled to certain social services. Germans eased their citizenship law about 2 decades ago, when they suddenly realized they couldn't adhere to this old notion that you were a German by blood. So you might have been German 2 generations ago, when your grandparents moved to Catherine the Great's Russia, and you could come and get German citizenship by right of being German somehow. But you had lived in Germany all your life, but you couldn't get citizenship. They modified that. Now they've eased up on the ability to get German citizenship and then full entitlement. More importantly, so there's social services, there's the path to citizenship. But most importantly, there's this strenuous effort to bring newcomers into this training system. Now, the apprenticeship system has been quite slow to bring in the immigrants. They're not even doing that well with the Turkish guest workers who've been in Germany for a few decades. That's lagging, but it's there and it's slowly working. And I believe the surest way in any society to foster social integration, this idea of mutual understanding and mutual respect across ethnic communities or linguistic communities, religious communities, is by common responsibilities in work as productive members of society. And so by having a training system that really helps people acquire the skills they need to do a good job and not just some low wage, low skill job on the night shift in the hotel, but actually to have an opportunity and their children have an opportunity to acquire skills that enable them to move up in society, I think Germany's system is designed in such a way that they probably have a pretty good chance of making it work. What's happened so far with the 1 million refugees in 2015, which is 6 years ago, they've been more successful than you might have thought in absorbing them. So I'm cautiously optimistic that it'll be possible to absorb them so that they then become contributing members and not dependents on the social services.
I thank you. I think, at least on my screen, we've come to the end of the questions, Tom. Everybody, thank you. Thank you for coming. Thank you for joining us, Tom. Thank you for really moving us along in thinking about Germany. Brenda, you want to wrap up? Guess not. Yeah. Okay.
No, she's
Thank you.
muted. Brenda, you're muted.
But thank you all for joining us.
Sorry, I was muted. I do that too. So thank you all. It was really a fascinating talk. Great to see you all. Can't wait to see you all in person, but for now, we see little thumbnails. So thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you, everyone.